I'm actually starting on the left, and I point the needle this way, and I start it the same as usual. And then holding it backwards, that's why it's called the back stitch. Holding it backwards, you go under just a little bit. See that? I know. It's the same thing I did but backwards, but I was holding the needle in the wrong direction. See how the sharp point of the needle is facing where you start? Do you guys see that? Please stop talking, I'm recording. Okay, so the needle faces where you began. See, the needle is going to point over at the beginning. So do you see how the needle points back towards the beginning? And it makes a loop. Do you guys see that? Zoom in. Do you see that? Look up at the board. Look up at the wall. It makes a bit of a loop. And then it tightens. And look at the right side. Little tiny stitches. Zoom out. See? Little tiny stitches. So every time you go over about a 1/4 inch, you come under like a 1/16. Zoom out. And I want to show you that you could do it very fast. You are?
No, Mr. If I work for a table, I would fire first. I don't have closer to that. Now, slide around this thing. You serve chickies? Give me
You can pass it from one finger or from one hand to the other. See, I'm using my right hand, passing it to my left hand, and just pulling it tight, and then going back, poking with my right, pulling with my left.
How far do you do each one apart?
They're approximately between a 1/4 and a 1/2 of an inch.
So like the first one?
Yes.
Second one.
More like the running stitch length. And make sure that the under part is very tiny, because the right side you want to look very sparse. Zoom in. Guys, look up at the wall. Do you see how on the right side you only see a little tiny bit, and on the back side that is where you bring it through. Now I'm about to show you how to end it, so pay attention. So once you get about an inch away from the end, you're going to come back real close to where you were before, and you're going to do the super knot. 1, 2, 3. Hold and pull. Nice and tight. Pull it through one more time, because I don't like that knot coming undone. And snip it. Done. All right, as you can see, we've finished the back stitches here. You should have the basting stitch and the running stitch above this. What you're going to do next is you're going to actually have to fold over part of your fabric for the slip stitch, which on my example looks like this. See the yellow stitch? Zoom in. So the yellow stitch, this is the slip stitch. So what we're actually going to have to do is about maybe 3/4 of an inch or so below the back stitch. We're going to have to fold over our fabric. Okay? I want you to fold it over. Now ideally you should iron this, but since we don't have an iron, you could just fold it over and use your finger, and the friction should keep the fabric down, so it keeps it held nice and tight. Okay? Then you're going to bring the fabric back underneath, and you're going to fold it on top, overlapping maybe 1/4 inch roughly. And again, just smooth it down with your finger. The friction that your finger creates will create enough heat to keep the fabric in place for you to do the sewing sample. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but try to keep as straight a line as possible so that the top and the bottom of your fabric are parallel. Okay? Now that you have this nice smoothed out fabric, we're going to sew a slip stitch which keeps the 2 layers of fabric connected. Okay? So this is what you would do to sew the hem of pants. At the bottom of the pants, around the cuff, you sew the hem. This is also called a hem stitch, but the technical term is slip stitch. Alright? So let's begin. I'm facing the open side towards me, just because that's my preference. And you're going to start on the right side if you're right-handed. And you are going to go down through the very end of the fabric. Let's get a close-up here. So you're going through the very end of the fabric and just inside the bottom fabric. So it's very little bit of fabric that you're picking up. See? What it does is it holds the 2 pieces together. This is the only one that you start by doing the stitch right into it. You don't start it separate. You just start sewing together. You put your needle in between the threads where the knot is. Pull it nice and tight. And you're literally just going to go over and do the same thing. You just go down through the fabric, see? And I'm holding it sideways, so it's actually easier for me to hold it long ways and to sew forward as I go. In sewing, it really doesn't matter how you hold it, as long as you do the stitch right and, you know, everything comes out. So I just move along, just barely go in, barely come out. And it creates this nice little, almost like a zigzag as I go down. You want them to be about 1/4 inch, which is about the same as your running stitch or your back stitch. So every 1/4 inch, you just go over and come down through the top and just barely through the bottom. Let's take a look at the back side. Look how nice and neat that is. It's very similar to the back stitch. You only have a little bit of fabric, a little bit of thread coming through the fabric. Just little tiny bits. Zoom in. See how close, how tiny that is? Okay? So this keeps the top layer of fabric down to the bottom layer of fabric. You can see why this would be used for the end of your pants. All right, I'm just going to continue sewing until I get to the end. And I'm going to finish as usual.
Keep recording.
Keep recording. You don't want to pull it too tight. You want to keep it in place. But if you pull it too tight, it's going to bunch the fabric, and you don't want to do that. You just want it to keep the fabric where you ironed it. Let's try it from another angle. This might be what it looks like to you as you're sewing it. You go up a 1/4 inch, barely through the fabric. You sew from the top down through the bottom. Oops. You want to make sure not to get your thread caught in the last loop. Just finish it off real quick, or as quick as I can. Now notice how I'm trying to make all the stitches pretty much the same width apart, so that way it looks pretty even. Oh, come back. It looks pretty even on the right side of the fabric. How you doing, third period? You keeping up? You guys got this stitch? This one's pretty easy. It's pretty fun. It's almost like doing a seam because you're you're connecting two pieces of fabric together. Every stitch you guys are learning, you are going to use it to combine two pieces of fabric. We're just practicing how to do the stitches. Now we're actually combining it. We're making sure these two pieces of the fabric are connected together. Well, then I'll re-show the video and you can catch up. Okay, one more.
You ever poke yourself with the needle?
All the time. Not anymore though. All right, folks. Here's how we're going to end it. Let's get a nice close-up of this. We go through. Very close to where we came out. 1, 2, 3. Does this look familiar?
Super now.
And we pull it tight. And remember, I always like to come through one extra time. So that way, the knot, if it came undone, which I doubt, would not fall apart. And then cut. So there you are. 2 pieces of fabric joined together on the side. Okay, cut. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start our next and final stitch for the sewing sample. Here you should have your running stitch, your basting stitch, then your back stitch, your slip stitch, and the very last stitch is the zigzag stitch. This one is just like a back stitch, except you zigzag. So you're actually going to start 1/4 of an inch, so very close to your slip stitch, and you're going to go backwards. So we're going to start it just like we would a back stitch. Put your needle in between your thread. Okay, start it just like normal. Get a nice little knot started. Shh. Then, instead of going straight across, you're going to zigzag, and you're going to keep the needle pointed toward the beginning just like you would a back stitch. So you go down about 1/4 of an inch and pull through. Okay. And there's the zig. And for the zag, you go back up to the top along the same line, just a little bit down from where your slip stitch was. And again, you're pointing the needle back towards the beginning and pull it through. And there you can see kind of a V shape. So now we're going to go back down again along the same line, needle facing back towards the beginning. So if you're right-handed, that means it's going to be facing the left. And if you're left-handed, you'll be facing the right. Pull the needle back toward the beginning, and there you go. You've got zigzags going on. This one's pretty easy if you understand the back stitch. This one should be no problem. The reason that you would use a zigzag is for combining 2 pieces of fabric where you want a little bit of give. So for instance, if you wanted a side seam for say like a woman's skirt, you would use a zigzag, so that way if the fabric needed to stretch a little bit and get a little bit tight, it wouldn't break. The stitches wouldn't break. They would, the fabric in between would just bunch up instead of snapping. So this is good for places where you need flexibility in the costume. Okay, I'm just gonna continue doing the rest of the stitches. Some people prefer to do this facing up and down, either way. As long as the needle points towards the beginning, it doesn't really matter how you do it. Now I noticed that I'm getting a little bit inconsistent with my zigzag. It's getting a little bit thinner and wider. You do want to try to be consistent. So these stitches that I did were all fairly consistent, but right about here I started doing skinnier in between. It's a little bit thinner in between here and longer in between here. You want to be consistent. So so however big your zigzag stitches are, you want to keep them the same. Be consistent. You may notice I'm putting my hand behind the fabric. It's not necessary. It just kind of makes it easier, makes it faster to show you the sample. But you should be able to do this just holding on to the fabric in front of you, especially if you're sewing on a table that's not covered with cloth like this ironing board is. Fairly simple, just like the back stitch.
That's what he told me.
Shut them up. Perhaps the level of talking you're hearing from my second period will let you know why they are about 5% behind in the class average compared to my other classes. Remember, you must be focused for theater, and sewing is no exception. Of course, it's okay to sew during to talk while you're sewing, because you should be able to talk and sew at the same time. It's a pretty mindless and kind of soothing activity. A lot of the times actors will knit or sew while they're studying their lines, just so that way they kind of learn their lines on a subconscious level. Sewing, like I said, is very soothing. It can be, if it's something you like doing. It's repetitive, so it doesn't take a lot of thought, but it is very important for the theater so that you can make costumes. Alright, when you get to your last one, doesn't matter which side it is, top or bottom, you get your last zig or last zag. You're just going to go back into it, wherever you ended, come back up, and guess what? 1, 2, 3 knot. Right? You're going to do a super knot. 1, 2, 3. Right, 1, 2, 3, wrapped around, and then you're going to just pull through. Pinch and pull. Put it through one more time, just for good measure. And here's how it should look on the back. You've got 2 distinct rows of back stitches, basically. And this fabric, when 2 pieces of fabric are together, it will be able to bunch up without breaking in between those 2. So if you need a lot of give, you want to put two spaces very far apart. If you just need a little bit of give, do what we just did, where they're about a 1/4 inch apart. Alright, we're finished. Hi there, welcome. Today we're going to sew our first seam. We're sewing the simplest seam, which is the double stitch seam. You're going to have your large piece of fabric and your tinier piece of fabric. And I want to make sure that we identify the wrong side of the fabric. As you can see, there's a nice Christmassy pattern on this side, and then it's just kind of like blah on the back side. So the side that we want people to see, the pattern side, is the right side, and the back of it we call the wrong side. So I wrote the word wrong. It's probably very difficult to see, but it says wrong on the fabric. Since this fabric is the same on both sides, it doesn't really have a right or wrong side, so we're gonna label that wrong as well, so that we know which side is right and which side is wrong. You should have already finished doing all of your stitches along from side to side. Of course, starting with the running stitch, then the basting stitch, then the back stitch, then the slip stitch, and then the zigzag stitch. So what we're going to do for the double stitch seam, we're going to put the wrong side of the fabric to the wrong side of the other fabric. So see, I'm sorry, correction. We're going to put the right side up against the right side. Okay? So we're putting the right side against the right side so that we can see the right sides are touching. The right side and the right side here. And then on the outside we can see the wrong side and the wrong side of the fabric. Okay? So, as with any seam, it's a good idea to pin it before you start sewing to make sure that the fabric doesn't shift or move while you are sewing. So simply put the pin in, then come out. Remember, you can do it along the seam or across the seam as long as it keeps the fabric together. I really, don't have a preference. So you put your pins in, keep the fabric from moving. Be careful, especially if you're pinning using something that has fabric, not to pin through the fabric, because then then you're sewing through your table instead of through your project. All right, so I've already threaded a needle. Where are we at? So I've got this threaded needle. I hope that you guys can keep up. This camera's not very zoomed in. So we're just gonna do a very simple running stitch, and we're gonna do it about a 1/4 to 1/2 inch away from the seam. So start it by just going in and coming out right away. We're going to put our needle in between the threads where the knot is. So we have our first little knot there, holding everything tight, keep everything from slipping out. So you never have to turn the fabric over. You always just go through the top and push it under the bottom, and through the top and under the bottom. And try not to do too many stitches at one time, because you do want a straight line. I've been doing this for a while, so I usually have a pretty good sense of how to keep a straight line. Some people think it's a good idea to hold the fabric underneath. That's especially true if you're using fabric to sew on top of. So we're just going to sew this up and down until we get to the end. Pull it through. Now, it doesn't matter if you're right-handed or left-handed, but you know, the needle for the running stitch is going in the direction from where you start to where you end, which is the opposite of the back stitch, where you point the needle back to where you started. So just keep it running in a nice straight line. Simple in and out, in and out. And ideally, you want these stitches to be less than 1/4 of an inch. I'm trying to rush through this to show you the example, so I'm going through and doing the stitches about twice as big as you want them. Okay, so if we compare that to our ruler here, it should actually be about half the size that they are. See, they're about roughly about 1/4 of an inch big. You want them a little less than that. The finer the stitch, the less of a seam you're going to get. So I want to show you something before we move on. Everybody look up at the projector. See how the stitches going across are holding the fabric together, and you can't see the stitches. The finer you make the stitches, the better, because as I'm about to show you here, you can see where the stitches come together. If you have tinier stitches, it'll be harder to see when you actually iron the fabric back. So, as usual, I like to lock my final stitch. So I do this method where I put the needle in and then come right out near the hole, near the end where I ended. Wrap the thread around 3 times, 1, 2, 3. Hold the thread and the place where I rolled it around 3 times. Pinch that and pull the fabric through. Creates a nice little knot. And if you want to, you can go through one more time just to keep the thread secure. But that's pretty good. It's not moving. And then, since this is a double stitch seam, it's rather simple. You just continue on by sewing a little bit above where you sewed your first row of stitches, and you could do the same stitch or a different one. Usually I like the bottom one, the one that's the final row of stitches, to be a lock stitch or a back stitch, and then the top stitch to just be a running stitch to hold the fabric together. So again, we're just going to go in and then come out, go back through the 2 pieces of thread to create a lock, and continue just going in and out. The reason you do 2 rows of stitches, of course, is to make it more secure and to prevent the fabric from fraying. And you know, 2 rows of stitches are stronger than 1. One thing is you can use your first row of stitches as a guide to see if you're going straight. You know, keep them evenly spaced. But the second row doesn't matter as much. The bottom one is the one that matters. The one that's farthest away from the seam, or from the edge of the fabric. Once you get done, you're going to have something like that, where you have 2 rows of stitches that are one just right above the other, and that's going to help hold everything in place. Okay, the last step in a seam is pressing it. Pressing is another word for ironing. So we've got our iron, put a little steam in there. We're using cotton fabric, so you don't have to worry about burning or melting the fabric. So we have this nice bit of fabric. We have the seam, and what we want to do is we want to press the seam open to one side. So you can either press on the right side or press on the wrong side. I actually prefer pressing on the wrong side. I feel like it gets everything a little more smooth, but kind of this is what you're going to want. You're going to want a nice seam between the 2 different pieces of fabric. So like I said, I like sewing on the pressing on the wrong side of the fabric. So I smooth everything out. And for this project, I want you to press your seams toward the biggest piece of fabric. So I want you to press it toward the bigger piece. Start in the middle and then move your way out to press down the seam. Grab a little steam. Just turn it over, make sure we got it right. Beautiful. Okay, you have a nice even seam, and you know it's kind of obvious with the 2 different pieces of fabric. You know, that's why we're doing the example this way. But if you had 2 pieces of fabric that were the same color, you know, it'd be really hard to tell where one starts and one ends. So that's how you do the double stitch seam. Alright, now I'm going to be sewing the French seam. Here's my example for you guys. We have the original stitches, the running stitch, the basting stitch, the back stitch, the slip stitch, the zigzag. Down here, you see we've done a double stitch seam. which I actually want on the top. I'd prefer you to do it on the top. Then you're going to do a French seam. A French seam, it's a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to start with our sewing example here. See, we have the double stitch seam right there. For the French seam, instead of putting the right sides together like you did here with the double stitch seam, you're going to put the wrong sides together. So this is the wrong side, this is the wrong side. We're going to put those together. There you go, match them up. And again, for every seam that you do, it's a good idea to have some pins holding everything steady. Put the pins in this way so that I don't accidentally poke myself while I'm sewing. Remember that the object of the pins is just to keep the fabric flat together, to keep it from moving. Now note that this fabric is just a bit off, so I'm just trying to do the best I can to keep it straight. You notice over here it's pretty straight, and over here it's pretty straight, but there's a little excess here and there. Don't worry about those types of things. It's just a sewing example, but if you were sewing, a real project, you'd want your measurements and your cuts to be exact. So here we go. We've got our pins pinned down, and we're ready to sew on the right side. So for the first one, I'm going to do just another simple running stitch. So I'm going to do it about between 1/4 and 1/8 of an inch from the edge. I don't want it to be too close, because then it might not grab all the fabric, and I don't want it to be too far away because it's going to be wasteful of the fabric. So again, a good running stitch should be less than 1/4 of an inch or so, and you need to practice running straight stitches all the way down. You don't want it to get too crazy. So we've got a nice straight line happening here. So if I continue on with this line, I'm not going to run off of the fabric here. Okay. If you've sewn it right, then your fabric should still lay flat. You don't want it to pull and wrinkle the fabric because you made your stitches too tight or something like that. So there you go. So this is just the first stitch. And the next step in this process is that we're going to actually shave off some of this fabric. So you're going to take some straight scissors and I want you to cut very close to the stitches that you've made. Like, we're talking very close, like really, really close. About a 1/16 of an inch away is what I like. But if you leave up to an 1/8 of an inch is fine. Remember that scissors are not as good as shears. Shears are made for cutting fabric. Scissors are made for cutting paper. So if you have a pair of shears at home, or you can borrow a pair of shears, I would strongly suggest it because cutting fabric with scissors can be annoying and tricky. Okay. So like I said, we're just cutting away the extra so that we have about a 1/16 of an inch left over on the edge. All right, so here we are. We've cut away most of the fabric away from the edge. And now we're going to do something a little strange. We are going to open it up. We are going to iron it down. I guess for this one it doesn't really matter which way you iron it, but I usually like to iron toward the area where I want the main part of my costume. So I sew toward the biggest piece of fabric. Here we go. So we've sewn that down. But oh no, what do we do? There's the wrong side, it says wrong. Well, we can see the wrong side of the fabric on both sides. But if we look over here, we can still see a seam. We don't want that, right? This is going to be our good piece of fabric. We want it to look like this overall. Well, we're not finished. So I want you to fold this down. You can see your nice, neat seam there. And I want you to also iron that out. I want you to iron as close to the seam as possible. Be very careful, but you're going to iron this thing out and get it nice and straight and even. It's kind of tricky. You've got to go slow and be patient with the iron. Otherwise, it's going to look rather messy. So, Now we have this. We have the two pieces of fabric, and on the inside we have this tiny little seam. You can sew and then iron before you cut the seam, which is also another good trick, because if you're not very good with the iron, it's actually easier to iron this down and then turn this over and iron this down with a longer bit of an edge here. So we have this all ironed down, nice and neat. We're going to come back in with some pins to hold everything in place. So you have this all pinned down. As you can see here, we have the wrong sides on the outside, and we're going to complete our second stitch, which is going to leave us with a thick seam on the wrong sides of the fabric. So for the second stitch, I would like you to use something more secure than just a running stitch. So for this one, I prefer a lock stitch, but a running stitch will work. If you're going to use a running stitch, make it a very tiny running stitch. So we're going to start off as normal with a back stitch. You start facing away from where you're sewing. So I'm sewing this direction, the needle's pointing this direction. Remember, every time you start, sew it in just a little bit and come back through your the two threads that you began with. Now, I'm going to move this pin so that I don't get poked by it. Remember, if you're sewing on something like fabric, to lift up your sewing, it not only gives you a little bit more control, but prevents you from putting your needle through the fabric. Okay. Now, every once in a while I'll adjust the fabric to make sure it's not moving. You know, I want my stitches to be to be somewhat tight, but I don't want it to pull the fabric and cause wrinkles. So just constantly, look at your work, make sure that you're not making any mistakes. Okay, so then we're going to finish it. We came out right there. You can see where the fabric is coming, the thread is coming out of the fabric. So we're going to poke the needle in one more time and come out close to where the thread originally came out that last time. Okay, we're gonna wrap the needle with some thread 1, 2, 3 times. We're gonna hold it and pull the needle through with our other hand, and that creates a nice knot. All right. So are we done yet? Well, not quite. We have a French seam, but we need to iron it to press it open. So cut this. Pull this open. All right. Here, see we've got the stitches, but the seam isn't pressed open yet, right? It's not like this one, it doesn't lay flat. So we're gonna have to lay it back. Grab our iron. And again, remember, I want you to press the fabric toward the inside, towards the first piece that we started with. All right. Oh, looks like I forgot to leave my iron on. Well, but you get the idea. And you are left with a nice, clean edge. And then you can go over it again with the iron, really press it flat. And see, even though my iron is lacking heat, I'm still come out with this really nice seam. And then in the back, it's nice and thick and strong. And there you have it. That's a French seam. So now our final stage of this project are fasteners. So here we have these different types of fasteners. Now here we have snaps. The snap has a male and a female end, and they snap together. Here we have a button, and as you've seen, buttons are very common, just like on your shirt. If it buttons up, there's the button gets sewn onto one end, and on the other end there's a hole, a slit that the button fits into. And this is called a skirt hook. A skirt hook has a little round end, and this bar slips around it just like that, and then they lock. So we're going to attach these different fasteners onto either side of our fabric. But before we do that, we need to decide which end is going to be the top of our sewing project. You see, one of these ends is going to fit over the other end, and we're going to have a button sticking up out of the middle, and on the inside here we're going to have our skirt hook and bar and our snaps sewn on either side, and the button's going to be sewn here in the middle, and then on top the only thing we should see is the button. So we decide which side we want to be the top, and I'm going to decide this side to be the top. So what I want to do with the top is I want to fold it down and iron it and then sew it shut, so that way it doesn't look like a bunch of frayed ends. It looks like there's a smooth seam of fabric there. Well, this one is so small, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually press it before putting any type of pins in it. So, and I want to press a lot of it, just a little bit. And I want to keep that as straight as possible. Be very careful when you're using an iron, especially if you have no needles to hold down the fabric. Even the steam can burn you, so be very careful. So there we go. So if we look at it on this side, it's nice and clean, and on this side it needs to be sewn down. For this one, I'm going to let you choose which seam to use, but a very smart seam would be the slip stitch, because the slip stitch is made for this type of seam. This is called a hem. When you have a piece of fabric, sometimes it's folded under once or twice. I'm just going to leave it like this. But when you have a lip of fabric creating the bottom, like for example the bottom of pants, this is a hem. So we're gonna make a hem stitch. So I'm gonna put in my needles. And I usually like to sew the hem vertically. So I'll start at one end and I simply go from the top just to the underneath on the other side of the fabric, and then I come through after just a little tiny bit. You can see there, it's not a very big stitch. So I come through, and as usual when I start, I'm going to come back through before my knot in between the two pieces of thread, and I'm going to come back through Just noticing it's a bit hard to see, so I'm adjusting the camera. So again, I'm going to go down from the top of the fabric, down through the bottom of the fabric, and just make a tiny, tiny stitch. Pull it through. And I'm going to repeat this process until I get to the other end. right back through and come out again where we started, where we left off. I'm gonna wrap around 1, 2, 3 times around the needle, pinch it, and pull it through. Like a nice knot. And you know me, I like to go through it one more time to hold the knot down. So now we have this nice hem. Cut away my extra thread. There you have the top of your sewing project. Bottom, we're just going to leave it the way it is. But of course, if it was a real piece of clothing or costume, you'd want to sew that. You wouldn't want to leave it, but it's good enough for now. Okay. So at some point, we've got to decide how far we want to go. We want our sewing project to overlap. So we're going to fold it twice. We're going to line up these seams, and then we're going to press it down. Alright. So, the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to have to cut a hole for our button. So what I'd like to do is to know basically where my button's going to go. I'm going to have to use a pair of scissors . So I'm going to find the center. I can use the ruler to do that. Roughly 8 inches. And find the center on the back. It's about 8 inches. Half of 8 is 4. So I'm going to put the middle of the button right at the middle of the 4. I can trace my button, or I could just put a mark on either side of the button. See, the mark is just a little bit bigger than the actual button itself. And I'll just draw a straight line that goes along the edge of the fabric. See that? So now I know where I'm going to cut. But before I do that, I should fold up the fabric like this. Try to make it even. This is an easy way to make the cut. So there we have it, a nice, neat button hole. So again, we're going to fold this down. Even it out. And we're going to put our pencil right in the center of the buttonhole. And we know where to put the center of our button. So now we could sew our button on right there. And we know where it's supposed to go. So sewing a button should be pretty easy for you guys. It's very simple. One thing you want to do is you want to start in the back. So I like to put my needle right in the center. I'm going to come up through one of the holes in the button. I'm going to come down. Let's see. I'm going to come down through a different hole. And when I come back through, what I like to do is come through the middle of those two threads, just like we do when we're sewing a row of stitches. And I'm gonna pull it tight. There you go. You have the button in place, and then you can play with it. You just sew. There's lots of different patterns. Simple pattern is you just sew in through one hole and then to the one right next to it. So come down the one next to it. You do that a few times. A good number is about 3. So there's 2 and 3. And then the next time, try to come up through the other side. 1. Now when you get to the back, when you've actually gone through the button several times, so 3 on this side, 3 on that side, you have this thread in the back, and some people don't know what to do with it. Well, what I like to do is go through some of my other loops that I went through and come out and finish it just like I normally do. I've got this needle sticking out here. I go around it 1, 2, 3 times, pinch and pull. This can be kind of difficult at the back of a button, but if you can get it, then it makes it nice and strong. You know me, I like to go through 1 extra time, just for good luck. And then we're gonna clip it. Cut the thread. And there you go. You have this nice secure button on there. And when we fold it over, we will find that it fits right there. So that's how you sew a button. Now, eventually, this little button, it's already starting to do it, it's gonna fray, and the little pieces of fabric are gonna come apart. Well, You can sew this with a sewing machine. It will actually sew a button for you. It will sew around the buttonhole. But since we don't, since we're doing this by hand, another method is to simply come in and start making loops. I always like to sew on the wrong side of the fabric so you don't see the place that we started. Remember those lines that we drew? These vertical lines right here and here? We're going to sew along those first. I'm going to sew it a little bit wide. The reason we do that is so that it doesn't continue ripping along where we cut it. So we're going to sew it 3 times at the top. And again, you don't want to pull so tight that it causes your fabric to bunch. That's 2. And that's 3. Okay. So what you can do is open it up with your finger and very carefully start sewing loops down the open hole. And all this does is keep everything from fraying, from coming apart. Remember, a sewing machine is going to make it look nicer, and of course you can do many loops to make it look embroidered, to make it look like it's all just kind of one piece. But a few loops is all you really need, just to keep the fabric from bunching. Okay, so you see how we've sewn one side? Now we need to sew the bottom 3 times. So across the whole bottom, both sides of the slit. 1. 2. And 3. Okay, now we're going to sew up the other side. Again, just simple loops. I'd say about 5 times on each side is a good number, but you can do 10, 15, however many you think looks right, and make it look a lot tighter. Okay, so we get back up to the top, and we're going to go through the big bundle of 3 that we had made, and we're going to wrap around 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Pinch it, pull through, and I like to go through one more time, pull the knot to the side, and I'll cut the extra thread off, and there you are. You're left with a buttonhole that's going to be nice and secure. It will prevent the fabric from coming unraveled. Right. See how that works? Nice. All right. So that's how to sew the edge of your top edge of your fabric. That's a hem. You can use this for the bottom of pants or for cuffs if you want to make an adjustable sleeve costume. So you can sew cuffs, and then here's how to sew a button. And in the next segment, I'm going to show you how to sew on the snaps and the skirt hooks on the insides, or I should say the wrong side of this fabric and the right side of this.